Hello, humans. That's a Monsters Inc. joke. Hello, everyone. I got your feedback from 415. I'm going to try to do my best to tackle them. And I've got some props. And can you name all the rotator cuff muscles again and reteach their function? Yes. So what I did is I went and got this picture, okay? So what I want you to notice is, again, the concept. So these are, let's say intrinsic muscles, but they're definitely not country muscles. Remember how I said country muscles have a lot of room to grow? And so the rotator cuff, if you look at them, what do they all have in common? They kind of reach out and grab a hold, encapsulate. Of course, you have a joint capsule that kind of provides like a water balloon effect with fluid and reduce friction. But these muscles encapsulate because unlike the joint capsule, which only can respond to being stretched, muscles can actively tense, right? You can innervate them and they pull more. They respond to neural stimulus. So it's like a second capsule, and it's encapsulating that entire humeral head. And in class, I referred to it as covering all of your bases. So you see that subscapularis covering the anterior base, and then you have that supraspinatus covering the top base, and then you have your infraspinatus and teres minor covering, doing a double play action on the back base. So in terms of their rotation function, in terms of their function for mobility, subscapularis pulls in a direction of internal rotation, because you could see, let me hold this right here. This is that is an anterior view. Oh gosh. That's not cool. Oh, I see what happened. So that's an anterior view, right? So if it pulls, you can imagine that it's going to be pulling medially or internally rotating, pulling in a direction of internal rotation. You look at the posterior view, comme ça, those muscles are pulling laterally, pulling in a direction of external lateral rotation. And then the supraspinatus on top of the spine is actually just pulling laterally. In other words, it's on the polar axis of the humerus, but it does cross the anterior posterior axis, so it would be pulling the humerus out like this in a direction of abduction, okay? So the importance of the rotator cuff in terms of function, we have to separate rotational function, what's an internal rotator, what's an external rotator, what's an abductor, from stability function. And that is collectively, they need to maintain that darn golf ball on that golf tee. So pretty much anytime you're actually moving your shoulder around actively, those rotator cuff muscles to some extent will be on doing their stability job, you know, maintaining stability, law and order, like policing the glenohumeral joint. Okay, so hopefully that helped to answer, clarify the rotator cuff. You know what's really cool too is you can see that groove, that bicipital groove right there. And so that biceps long head kind of passes right between the subscap, right between the subscap and the supraspinatus. Passes right between them and inserts on the superior glenoid fossa. It's cool. All right, next up. Our next question is, can you clarify neurological insufficiency in all the different quadrants? Okay, I'm going to do my best. And stop. Hammer time. So I brought a hammer. In class, I kind of pretended to use a hammer. But I've got a real hammer. We're going to use a real hammer today. So take note, in a semi-pronated position, like I am here, right? My brachioradialis, which I'm going to be representing with this lanyard, is straight. When I do this, I lengthen it. When I do that, I lengthen it, okay? So the point is that when I'm in a semi-pronated position, my brachioradialis can pull as much as it wants and not have to worry about any kind of secondary function. My biceps brachii, however, when you're in a semi-pronated position, it still wants to supinate you, and you kind of don't want to tip that over, right? Or if you had a dumbbell and it's counterbalanced, right? It doesn't take much force to do that to it, okay? So the concept of neurological insufficiency, let's break down that word. Neurological, what responds to neurostimulation? Just the contractile components, right? Not the stretchy stuff. So this concept isn't like a length tension concept. It's not like longer is stronger, which is true from the stretchy materials that make up a muscle, tendons and epimysium, endomysium. In 310, I defined them as series and parallel elastic properties, the inert stretchy stuff. The more you lengthen it, the more it's going to want to pull, return to its original shape. Neurological means that we're talking about the contractile components, the active components, the stuff that we zap and it pulls more, responds to neural stimulation, okay? So those don't just respond to length. You know, actually they do in terms of if you keep a constant nerve stimulation and you go longer than resting length, it's going to pull less. If you go shorter than resting length, it's going to pull less. However, because you can, you know, increase the zap, right? There comes a point where, depending on your radial ulnar joint position, where you choose, you could innervate certain muscles more, but you choose not to, because if you recruit them too much, you're going to have some unwanted secondary function. So the example I gave in class, again, let's pretend this is a dumbbell. Actually, 1 second, we'll get a dumbbell. Okay, so again, because this is counterbalanced, meaning that there's just as much force on one side trying to pronate me as there is on the other side to supinate me, when I'm in a prone position and I say, hey, biceps brachii, recruit all you got, not only will, if the weight is light enough, flex my elbow, but it's gonna supinate my radial ulnar joint. That's why it's so easy to kind of do this in all one motion, because that biceps brachii functioning at the elbow and functioning at the radial ulna, okay? In a prone position, you also have the brachioradialis that can supinate, pull in the direction of supination. So the point is that if your intent is to use flexors in a prone position, you will choose to not innervate biceps brachii or the brachioradialis as much as you potentially could, because you don't want to do this if you want to maintain that prone position. So the brachialis is like, dude, I don't have to worry about unwanted supination. I pull as much as you want. You can innervate the absolute heck out of me. And so that's what that means. The brachialis is sufficient where you can innervate it as much as you want and not have to worry about unwanted secondary function. In a fully prone position, the biceps brachii is neurologically insufficient, meaning that if you recruit it too much, you may have a secondary function of that muscle. So insufficient muscles have multiple joint functions. Biceps brachii, elbow, radial ulna, and shoulder. Brachioradialis, elbow, radial ulna. So the pattern is that multiple joint functioning muscles might not get innervated as much, depending on if you need to keep some neutral posture going. And I mean, these are some strong muscles. So your little pronator teres and pronator quadratus, they can't pull enough to really counter these big, powerful elbow flexor supinators. So what? So what do you need to know for the test? So what you need to know for the test is that when you're in a fully pronated position, your brachialis is the only muscle that's sufficient, meaning that it doesn't have to worry about secondary function. When you're semi-pronated, like this, you have two muscles that are sufficient. Still your brachialis is always going to be sufficient because it's tugging on the ulna. But now your brachioradialis is sufficient because in a semi-pronated position, it's midway. It's straight up and down. It doesn't have to worry about pronation or supination in terms of its direction of pull. In a fully supinated position, that's when your biceps brachii is finally sufficient, because at the end of that endpoint, that's not a soft endpoint, it's a firm endpoint. So that's why you feel like you can really recruit that muscle more, because it doesn't have to worry about supinating anymore because you're all the way at the end of your road. So again, for the test, fully pronated position, brachialis sufficient. Brachioradialis insufficient, biceps brachii insufficient. Semi-pronated position, brachioradialis sufficient, brachialis sufficient, biceps brachii still insufficient. In a fully supinated or anatomical position, brachialis sufficient, biceps brachii sufficient, brachioradialis insufficient, because it actually wants to pull in the direction of pronation. So I know it gets a little freaky, but just learn the so whats. That in the different positions, I'm just asking you to identify who does and who doesn't have secondary functions at the radioulnar joint and the elbow at the same time, okay? So hopefully that clears that up. The next question was about the brachioradialis. So I got my lanyard here, and what I'm going to try to show you is that in a semi-pronated position, okay, where the muscle is in a straight line, and I know I did this in class, but I know that I'm attaching it to my thumb, but that muscle doesn't cross the wrist. It's actually on the radial styloid. But because the wrist doesn't twist, wherever my thumb goes, my radial styloid goes. So it's not a bad symbolism. Just keep in mind, I know that it's not pulling my thumb. So the point is that when I'm semi-pronated, this muscle is straight. What's the shortest distance between 2 points of straight line? Shortest distance between 2 points, right? So when I supinate from there, I lengthen the muscle, showing you that the muscle could pull me back to a straight line. And when I pronate from there, I lengthen the muscle, so it could pull me back, right? Okay. So the brachioradialis can be a pronator or a supinator, depending on your radioulnar joint position. In class, we talked about quadrants. In anatomical position to semi-pronated, we call that quadrant 1, because that's where you start. It's the first one. And then if you continue to pronate from anatomical, then you drift off into quadrant 2, okay? In quadrant 1, the brachioradialis is a pronator, and that's why your circles have it listed as a pronator, because anatomical position is quadrant 1. If you drift off into quadrant 2, brachioradialis now becomes a supinator, meaning pulling in the direction of supination. The only time the brachioradialis is neither a pronator or supinator, there's only 1 degree in 180 chances, and that's exactly midway. At midway, it can't push me over, so at midway, when it's straight, all it can do is function at the elbow joint, okay? So one of the ways I tried to explain this is, if you know that any functioning muscle, a muscle that pulls in any direction, let's say the biceps brachii at the elbow is an elbow flexor, right? So concentrically, when it works through concentric work, elbow flexor, concentric work, you're going to observe elbow flexion. So if the biceps can make elbow flexion happen with concentric work, you know what it cannot do? It can't make extension happen with concentric work. I gave you this example in class. And if the bicep can work eccentrically to allow extension, guess what it cannot do? It can't work eccentrically to cause flexion. It's just, so it's the same thing with the brachioradialis. If the brachioradialis can pronate you to midway through concentric work, it cannot supinate you from midway with concentric work. And on the same lines, if the brachioradialis cannot pronate you to midway through eccentric work, right? In other words, it can only pull this way. It can supinate you from midway with eccentric work, but it cannot pronate you to midway with eccentric work. You see the difference? If you have an external force that's trying to do this, it can let you go down. But if you have an external force in quadrant 1 that's trying to do that, it cannot make you go down. So if it's a pronator in quadrant 1, that means working isometrically, it's going to prevent supination. Working concentrically, it's going to cause pronation to midway. And working eccentrically, it's going to allow supination from midway or slow down supination from midway. If we drift over into quadrant 2, now it becomes a supinator, meaning through concentric work, it's going to cause supination to midway. It can allow pronation from midway. It can slow down pronation from midway. It can prevent pronation in quadrant 2. But again, if it can work concentrically to midway, it cannot work concentrically from midway. It can't push it. And if it can work eccentrically from midway, it cannot work eccentrically to midway. So I think those little rules can help you and be important. And, okay. The next question is the last one. Can you clarify shoulder, please? Clarify shoulder. Guys, shoulders, let me tell you why shoulders it's because of scapula stuff. Contributes a lot to our functional circle. So we give a lot of credit to our shoulder, when in reality, the shoulder joint itself only contributes so much to it. You got these other things that kind of help out. And the shoulder gets all the love and all the credit. Shoulder is a ball and socket joint. Let me pull up on my son's, look how cute. My son, he loves penguins. He loves the penguins. So let's go back to Google and let's take a look at shoulder joint. Images. All right. It's a pretty good one. Okay. So there's the shoulder joint. And you see that kind of bluish stuff? That's articulating surface. So that's literally where golf ball has a chance to articulate with golf tee. It's the Highland stuff, the smooth stuff, right? So that's your options for articulation. So you have the socket part on the scapula itself. They call that the glenoid fossa. Fossa is just another name for a socket. And then you have the head of the humerus. And then there's some different terms for neck. There's like an anatomical neck, surgical neck, but who cares? Then the main thing here is that the humerus articulates with the scapula. That's it. And the articulation is called the gleno for glenoid fossa, the socket, humeral joint. Humerus for the ball. So there's your ball in your socket, gleno for the socket, humeral for the humerus. So glenohumeral joint. And if you think about that ball and how it articulates, and you think about planes and axes, first of all, this is an anterior view. How do I know there's an anterior view? I could see that coracoid process. I don't see the spine of the scapula. So that ball can roll on the socket in the sagittal plane. We call that flexion and extension in the fetal autofetal. Frontal plane, away from 6 o'clock, towards 6 o'clock, and in the transverse plane, hey, left arm, spin laterally, call that external rotation. Hey, left arm, spin medially, call that internal rotation. And so you're going to have muscles that pull in every direction of motion. You're going to have anterior crossing muscles, muscles that cross the shoulder joint in the front. That's going to literally pull like strings anteriorly, pulling in the direction of shoulder flexion. Call those shoulder flexors. A few of those that I gave you in class are like the anterior deltoid, the clavicular fibers of the pectoralis major, the biceps brachii, short and long head, the coracobrachialis. Then you have adductors. You have muscles that pull in the direction of adduction. Pectoralis major, remember lady between two majors, the three strips, right? So your pectoralis major is pulling in the direction of adduction. The latissimus dorsi coming from the back, but inserting on the front, pulling down, direction of adduction. Your teres major, sister muscle to the lat, and that kind of stuff. Then your abductors, I'm not listing them all, I'm just kind of going through how the shoulder, the question was just kind of clarify the shoulder. So the abductors are going to be pulling laterally, like on the outside. They're going to cross over the top. Let's see, they're going to cross over the top. Adductors are going to cross on the bottom. Abductors are going to cross over the top. Your major ones are your deltoid, your whole deltoid, and that's supraspinatus. Extensors are going to cross posterior, crossing the back. They're going to pull you back this way. Lat dorsi, teres major, posterior deltoid. And then you got your spinners, your internal, your external rotators. Your rotator cuff muscles were part of that, right? Your subscap was an internal. Infraspinatus, teres minor, externals. Other internal, big, powerful internal rotators. I told you guys in class why we need big, powerful internal rotators, right? To make a ball go 100 miles an hour in some cases. Pec major and latissimus dorsi and teres major, and subscapularis and anterior deltoid, some big, powerful internal rotators. And what speeds up must slow down. So we got to slow that down. And the external rotators, we got little infraspinatus, teres minor, posterior deltoid, but that biceps brachii can work both as an internal and external as a midway muscle. So if you have, extreme internal rotation as you're slowing down that internal rotation, that biceps brachii is spiraling around that humerus and can help put on that brake for you, which is very much appreciated, bicep. Thank you, buddy. So a couple things to take note about on your circles off the top of my head is remember, if you're referencing your circle, that the deltoid is one muscle composed of parts, fan-shaped muscle, right? So we have, if this is my deltoid, I have an anterior, I have a posterior, I have a middle, and the whole muscle is an abductor. The anterior fibers can be recruited to pull in a direction of flexion, internal rotation. When you need abductors, that's canceled out by the posterior fibers being extensors, external rotators. So they kind of cancel out each other and just pull laterally when you need full abductors. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind on your circle is that those sections are listed in separate squares for function. So I asked you to connect them to the middle so that you can be reminded that it's just one muscle with different parts. Another fan-shaped muscle is the pectoralis major, where all the fibers are adductor internal rotators, but only the clavicular fibers are shoulder flexors. So we go redundant and put the clavicular fibers on the anterior posterior axis to remind you that those guys are shoulder flexors. So, all right, guys, I hope y'all have a good break. Email me if, I don't mind if you have questions that you really need clarified and I can't write answers. We can chat, we can come up with a time to talk. But I hope everybody has a safe break, and I hope I answered all the questions that were given to me. I'm hoping there wasn't a lot of questions, so you were like, mostly we're good. So keep plugging along. Little bites of the apple, little bites of the apple. And I hope everybody has a safe break, and see you next Friday.